Thank you for joining us. We are awaiting Dr. Plum. She'll join us when she gets here. We have to excuse the DC traffic. So we're going to start with a little bit of a scene setter as we talk about what is on everyone's mind today, and it seems like for the past 2 years, which is generative AI. So now, almost 2 years after our introduction of generative AI, what do you all see as continuing challenges and opportunities with the technology? Mike, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks for having me here today. I think this is a really exciting topic since it's what I work on every day. The technology continues to fail in predictable and unpredictable ways. And so everybody, of course, is familiar with model hallucinations, where the model makes something up or says something that's not true. And that's predictable, but what can be unpredictable is don't always know exactly when it's going to do that. And so the technology is still at the stage where you need to have some oversight. And that's fine, right? Like, we hire junior people to do jobs at companies and government and so on. And we provide some supervision and training and guidance to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to. And if they make mistakes, there's an opportunity to fix it. And so I think, the technology is moving very quickly, and it's really important to start working with it now, right? If you had purchased the first iPhone and now you have an iPhone 14, you probably know how to use that 14 pretty well. If today's the first day you've ever used an iPhone, you're going to have a hard time trying to figure out how to navigate it and how to take the most advantage of it. And so even though the first iPhone wasn't as capable as today's, there was a lot of things that you could have done with it all along this time. And I think we're seeing some on the research side, some breakthroughs that are really addressing a lot of the big concerns that people have. So one of the concerns that folks have is, we don't know exactly how the models work on the inside and how they're coming up with particular outputs or decisions. Well, about a month ago, we released a paper on what we call mechanistic interpretability. So this is the idea of sort of reading the mind of a model. If you can see how the neurons activate in a model, you can understand why you're getting a certain output and maybe steer that output over time. Anthropic's made a huge investment in this space of mechanistic interpretability, and in this recent research we found that in one of our large production models we could understand about 30 million features, so concepts that the models understand, and we can dial those up or down to try to understand how that affects behavior. So there's a feature that activates when the model's thinking about the Golden Gate Bridge or when it's thinking about software vulnerabilities, for example. And these give you some insights in the possibility of steering behavior. And then the last thing I would say is that a lot of public sector customers have complained about the cost of the most powerful generative AI models. And last week we released our model Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which currently is the top performing model in the world according to most public benchmarks. And it's twice as fast as our previous largest model and at 20% of the cost. So things are moving very quickly, and the time to get going and get started is right now. Because this is going to set you up to prepare to take advantage of all the benefits that are going to come down the road. Thank you.
Elizabeth?
I would wholeheartedly agree that things are moving very quickly. And as we think back to even the last 2 years, we've seen huge improvements in terms of multimodal reasoning, sophisticated analytical skills. And those improvements open up huge opportunities around drug discovery and development, climate applications like weather prediction, carbon capture and storage, transformative benefits in education, all the things that we're all so excited about. But the increases in capability also open up sort of new frontiers of risk, and that's a lot of what we're focused on at the Safety Institute. Could these models be used to perpetuate more effective cyber attacks? Could they be used for the development of biological weapons? And how do we prevent that? And it's made all the more challenging given the huge number of open questions that still exists about how these models work, why they produce the outputs they do. There's certainly been a lot of leaps and bounds, but both the pace of development and the number of unanswered questions makes it a pretty complicated equation on both the risk and benefit side.
And Dr. Barra?
Yeah, great. It's always a danger because everyone in this room is smarter than I am when it comes to technology. So I'll stick to my lane as a doctor, and then it gets worse as a congressman. I'd start with the opportunities as opposed to the challenges, because again, thinking about healthcare and thinking about it from the perspective, it has the ability to improve outcomes, improve efficiency, address workforce issues, et cetera. You're already seeing the early adoption on the easy stuff, having it listen to the physician with the patient and write their notes for them. That's going to be widely adopted. The stuff that relieves the administrative burden on doctors But the really exciting stuff in generative AI is, how does it make me a better diagnostician? How does it, if I read that x-ray, I'm an internist by training, I might miss the calcifications, et cetera, but if those models have looked at millions of x-rays, it might pick up something that my eye is not going to pick up. That allows me to make an earlier diagnosis. So I think it really does have the ability to improve patient outcomes, improve efficiency, et cetera. The challenge is, physicians are human beings, so they're going to have some concerns about, is this going to take me out of a job? And you see some of those concerns. I think, again, like with electronic medical records and other things, you'll have some resistance on the front end, but over time they'll take that up. Liability issues, what does that look like? What's the regulatory environment like? Again, I think from the federal perspective, how do we get it right and put up the right guardrails but not stifle innovation? And then with regards to generative AI, the FDA may have the regulatory framework in place, but you regulate a device or a machine learning model today, it's going to be a very different model a year from now. What does that look like? Because as it's learning, it's getting better, et cetera. Do you go back? And so these are questions that we'll have to grapple with, and we want to do that in partnership with industry just to think about how should we think about this.
I think something that you really touched on is that everyone is still learning, right? No matter where you are in the journey and what part of public, private, congressional sector you're in. So I'm going to go to Elizabeth. What is the AI Safety Institute doing to advance our understanding of the implications of generative AI and develop best practices for the responsible use?
Sure. So I like your theme of still learning, and that's really what we're trying to encourage at the AI Safety Institute. Our mission, to put it simply, is to advance the science of AI safety, and at the same time to advance the implementation and adoption of that science. We, and indeed the entire Biden administration, firmly believes that safety breeds trust, trust breeds adoption, and adoption breeds innovation. And promoting safe AI innovation is really our North Star at the Safety Institute. How are we going about achieving that? Well, we've got 3 pillars of work. The first is that we're doing direct testing of AI models, systems, and agents, focusing especially on frontier generative AI models. We're going to be building out a suite of evaluations to use as data on how AI models perform, what capabilities they exhibit, and what risks are posed by those capabilities. This is going to be an entirely new US government capacity to directly test frontier AI models and systems before deployment across a range of risks. In our initial pilot stage, we're focused especially on capabilities that could pose a threat to national security. I talked about significantly lowering the barrier to development of chemical or biological weapons or perpetuating cyber attacks. But we're also going to be looking at societal harm perpetuated by frontier models and systems. And we're going to be sharing feedback with model developers on where mitigations may be needed prior to deployment. The second bucket is around guidance. We'll be issuing guidance on a range of topics, including how developers can plan for risk-proportionate safety and security mitigations to prevent malicious use, putting out an overview of tools and techniques to help detect synthetic content and to authenticate content. Our goal here is really to help spur a robust ecosystem of third-party evaluators and in-house evaluators who rely on our guidance, as well as independent researchers, so we can all be working together to help advance safety. And the last piece is around fundamental technical research. This is going to be core to our work, looking at questions like the interpretability of AI models, as well as research and development on new and improved risk mitigations. We are well aware that this field is evolving so quickly, and that our work really needs to be iterative and adaptive. It can't be just issue guidance, walk away from it. We want to have a cycle of research, guidance, and real-world use and testing that all inform each other and that continually adopt and iterate, so we can help advance our understanding of these risks and make sure that we're working with the developers to have the right mitigations in place.
And then transferring from the administration to agencies, welcome Dr. Plum. You have the monumental task of bringing together diverse talents and cultures from 4 different organizations. So from the DoD perspective, how are you thinking about technology advancement and modernization?
Thank you. I think we try to start all of our work inside the Department of Defense, starting with the capabilities that are needed for our warfighters and working our way back. So for those capabilities, we want to figure out in a sort of human-centered way and building on tools, for instance, that NIST produce, as well as our own responsible AI framework, where AI tools, AI-enabled tools can be integrated into those workflows. And inside CDAO, we do that in 3 different buckets. The first is to make sure we have the enabling documents and frameworks and policies that allow people to understand what they can adopt, where to adopt, and how to adopt them. That starts, as I mentioned, with our responsible AI framework, but also relates to things like data interoperability and data accessibility. And so that sort of body of work is really intended to enable and democratize the decision on what AI tools can be used where in the department. The second piece then is on the scale. And to enable scale in the CDAO side, where we're really focused is on what enterprise level capabilities are needed to allow adoption. We've created what we term AI scaffolding, which really builds some key enablers together. The first is labeled data on priority use cases. The second is on an environment to develop and experiment with that technology. And the third piece is test and evaluation, which covers the full suite of our risk management, from cyber risks to sort of operational testing and evaluation to make sure the models are doing what we want, to our responsible AI toolkit that really tests the models to make sure they're aligned with the responsible AI framework. The last piece then is really speed, and that is trying to accelerate adoption inside the Department of Defense. I don't think it will shock anyone to suggest the department can be a little bit slow on the technology frontier, especially with digital tools. So a lot of our work on the speed side is really focused on identifying where are those use cases that we can prove out the value proposition of AI-enabled tools and then get those in the hands of people who can prove their use. I'm just today back from visiting Central Command down in Florida, which is really at the forefront of some of the digital innovation that's happening, and they're enabling AI technologies to really accelerate and prioritize insights and decision support to senior leaders. That's really critical on a range of things from operational to administrative. I'll just close by saying I think taking that human-centric approach lets us really make sure that we're leveraging the tools for their generative capacity to help create decision ideas, to help triage large amounts of information, but we always have sort of the humans and the warfighters in that validation phase, that making sure what comes out of the model is useful and meaningful and aligns to both our principles and our operational needs.
And I think one thing that we can say is that there's a universal agreement, whether it's even in a partisan world. There's a bipartisan, bicameral agreement that we want the US to be a world leader in technology, and especially with generative AI. So what can be done, you think, at the agency level to really leverage the best technology and assure that we're staying agile in a traditionally slower environment?
Yeah, I think there are 2 big things we are trying to do in the Department of Defense. One is to be less hard to work with. And I say that somewhat jokingly, but really, you know, we have a lot of investments to date in things like our data infrastructure, our IT infrastructure, really catching ourselves up. That's great, and that's a really important enabler, but now we need to create the tools to actually allow companies to partner with us and solve our problems. What we're doing in the CDAO on that front is we've launched an ecosystem we call Open Dagger. I won't go through the acronym, but it's really intended to lay out from the Department of Defense side, where are those capability gaps that we think technology can solve? And then let's set up a routine and repeated process to bring that to partners in industry and help them help us. And we're doing that through a series of industry days. The first one is in mid-July. The second piece on that, though, is not just the resources and requirements, but actually just having sort of ongoing conversations with our partners in industry. Look, at the Department of Defense, we are not going to be on the cutting edge of developing AI tools, so we need to have a robust way to engage with the commercial sector on that. Again, just using the CDAO example, we've signed a partnership with DIU, a different part of the department that's really our partners in connecting with the commercial sector. And that's really intended to create a clear front door for folks to come in, figure out what technology we need and have that conversation be ongoing so we can broaden the industrial base that's supporting our needs.
And switching over now to Michael, more private sector. With Anthropic's incredibly fast pace of innovation, as you mentioned, how are you working with legislative bodies and other industry leaders to strike a balance between regulatory framework and responsibly deploy the new innovation that you all are so quickly releasing?
Yeah, well, I think one of the big challenges that we as a society have right now is that the gap between the public and private sectors in this technology is really vast, right? Current frontier models cost on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars to train. Probably next year they're going to be in the billions of dollars, or at least a single-digit billion. And that means that, partners, or parts of the ecosystem that normally would play a big role here are kind of priced out. I previously worked at Stanford before joining Anthropic. Stanford is a very wealthy university. I don't think that they're going to train a model that costs $1 billion. And so this basically means that, unfortunately, a lot of the knowledge that is developed about this technology really resides within a small number of private sector companies. And so one of the things that we do as a company, and we think is really critical, is try to close those information gaps between what we know in industry and what's known in civil society and in government. And so that includes doing things like translating technical research for policy audiences, conducting research that's of particular interest for the public or for folks in government to know. And then trying to prototype things that generate empirical information that could be sort of like proto-regulation. So one example here is Anthropic's responsible scaling policy. We were the first company to announce and implement a responsible scaling policy, which is a framework for how we deal with more catastrophic risks of the technology. Elizabeth discussed, how the technology could be misused to help build a bioweapon or conduct a cyber attack, or may develop levels of autonomy that could cause real problems if they got out of control. And so our responsible scaling policy is a framework for outlining kind of different risk levels. This is based on the biosecurity levels system that's used. The more dangerous a pathogen is, the greater the safety and security requirements you need to have around it. And then we make a series of commitments about what types of safety commitments we want to have in place and what kind of cybersecurity requirements we'll have for the company at these different levels. And then the most important thing that you need to be able to do is test and evaluate where the model falls on this scale. And so we're prototyping a lot of this. We're working with safety institutes like the US and UK safety institutes, because some of this knowledge about national security risks is only going to reside within governments. And then over time, as we learn, we're publishing what we've learned, we're making incremental changes, and we're helping to contribute to the development of sort of best practices for industry. And now, since Anthropic has announced its responsible scaling policy, Google and OpenAI have introduced similar policies. Last month at the Seoul Safety Summit, 16 companies around the world have committed that they're going to also have responsible scaling policies. And so hopefully over time, this will lead to the development of sort of industry consensus and best practices, and then government can come in, take the information we've developed, and decide, is this now ready to be sort of required in legislation, because maybe some companies are laggards and they're not living up to the kinds of commitments we'd like to see. But there's still a lot of work to be done here. The development of the science of evaluations is very nascent, and I think we've got a long way to go there. And so we're excited about the work that's happening at the AI Safety Institute in NIST. Anthropic published a blog about a year ago saying that we should create something like this, and we should get Congress to fund NIST at a higher level. The technology at the frontier is being developed in the United States, and the US should really lead in the development of standards and guidelines for the technology.
This is something I'll ask to Michael and then also open to everyone. As we talk about innovation and responsible AI, and Amazon was one of the first companies that signed on to the voluntary commitments with the White House. Responsible AI is something that we practice throughout. How do we then balance the need for being a world leader to stay ahead of the innovation, but also making sure that the regulation and the innovation is deployed responsibly? What is the balance between innovation and regulation?
Yeah, well, this is why I think we really focus on test and evaluation. There's a spectrum of risks that people are concerned about, from more near-term harms around bias and toxicity to more speculative and catastrophic risks. If you can test and evaluate, you can determine, is this model safe and responsible to deploy, or is it not? And if there are concerns, how do we address those, either in the context of deployment by adding additional layers of sort of defense and safety or user training, or does there need to be more fundamental research? And so I think a system that's based on actually testing and evaluating and not having like rigid checkbox of compliance is really key. If you think about the cybersecurity industry, before moving to Stanford, I worked in government at the NSC and the cybersecurity directorate. A lot of the frameworks for cybersecurity right now are very checkboxy. So they're not testing whether your system is secure, they're testing a proxy for that. So, you know, did your executive team have a meeting where they discussed cybersecurity? Do you have a disaster response plan in place, right? These are all kind of like rough proxies for whether you've thought about cybersecurity, but it doesn't actually tell you, like, is the system safe? If you compare that to, you know, if we went to go to a car lot today and we wanted to buy a new car, there are a lot of metrics you can look at. What's the fuel economy? How does it perform in different crash tests? And these are all tests that are run by third parties. There's a reliable, objective way of conducting the tests and evaluations. And you can make comparisons. You know, company A's car got 3 stars in a crash test rating. Company B got 5 stars. You know, you can choose as a consumer where you want to spend your money, what's your budget allow, and how important safety is for you. So that kind of flexible framework that's based on actual empirical measurement of the technology, I think, is the way that you balance innovation and adoption and responsibility.
I'll just add, this isn't the only realm where our values imply that we're going to put restrictions or guidelines, guardrails that bound what we're going to do to make our technology and our capability consistent with our values. And I think that's a feature, not a bug, right? So I think having test and evaluation, having these ongoing conversations where on the government side we can understand where the models can and should be tested both by the companies and then inside the government, and building that in as part of adoption is part of what sort of proving the value proposition of responsible AI globally is, and what it means to be a global leader in technology adoption.
100%.
Maybe I can just jump in, sorry, one more time on top of that. I think what the most sophisticated customers that we see in this space are the ones that know how to test and evaluate whether the model actually works for their use case. And so I think that the work that DoD is doing here to develop good evaluations for their use cases is the most important thing you can do to not only ensure that the technology is being used responsibly, but also speed adoption. It'll also make it easier for developers that might want to sell into government to test their models and see whether they're right for these use cases. So it serves a lot of purposes, and I think it's really great work that's happening.
I would just say this is an area where I think the EO really got the balance right. Full disclosure, before taking this job, heading up the AI Safety Institute, I was at the White House where I helped draft that executive order, and for whatever its benefits, brevity is not among them, so I'll give the quick synopsis. I think it makes an important distinction between how do we think about regulation of uses of AI and adoption of AI, where we have a whole series of regulators that have expertise in use of technology, including AI in healthcare, financial services, and there it is very clear that there's sort of no AI exception to the laws on the books. But for the underlying frontier models, like there the executive order really put us in sort of an intensive information gathering phase, making sure that there's reporting around the existence of frontier models, that we're doing the testing and evaluation, that we're putting out the voluntary guidance so that we can be iterative, adoptive as this technology continues to develop, and make sure that we're spurring the innovation and not putting blockers on that.
So a lot of this is going to fall to Congress then at the end of the day to sit down and say, okay, how do we write this regulatory framework? What does that look like? Again, to the credit of Speaker Johnson, Leader Jeffries, they did put this bipartisan AI task force together. We don't have legislative writing authority, but really what we're charged with is going out there, collecting the information, and then asking the question, again, how I think about it is what are the questions that we should be asking of the committees of jurisdiction? How should we think about this? The way we've approached the healthcare spaces, we actually went out to industry and sent out a broad RFI saying, how are you guys thinking about it? Whether it's health plans, pharma, provider groups, et cetera, and gathered that information. And because it's moving in the private sector a lot faster than it will. Listening to the conversation, I would embed the public sector in those conversations and those working groups, because I think it's going to be really important for the folks ultimately who will have to write that framework to really understand how the logic of the private sector, how they came to the conclusions that they did. So whether that's DoD, whether that's HHS or others, I think it would be better on the front end to include those folks in those working groups. And right now, Congress really isn't moving on this, and you've heard Steve Scalise say we're not going to write any regulations. That might not be the right thing. That could be. The problem is the states are moving ahead. I'm a Californian, and I see California writing their regulatory framework. I think it's real dangerous if you have 50 different frameworks. That could really stifle innovation. And I was having dinner with a number of EU ambassadors last night. I also think we ought to talk to our like-minded allies and think about what's that framework for folks that share our values. And so again, that we don't end up a year, 5 years from now with a set of European guidelines and a set of American guidelines and a set of Asian guidelines. I think those are conversations that we're thinking about right now.
Yeah, I think that the international cooperation piece is such a big part of what we're doing, what NIST has been proposing and promoting, and what the White House has been promoting, and what industry I think has also been very much leading on. So you mentioned the AI task force that you're a member of. You've been leading in AI. Even prior to the task force being established, you've been working on AI and patient care especially, and in Amazon, we were one of the companies that responded to your RFI. Healthcare is already a highly regulated industry.
Right.
And we've already seen some policies out of the administration that focuses specifically on AI and patient care. What do you think other industries could learn? You said inviting public sector to some of these conversations that we have, but what could other industries learn in terms of how to regulate effectively?
Yeah, so the administration has set out guidelines on transparency. I think that's a good thing. If I'm a doctor and I'm using AI to help make the diagnosis, I should talk to my patients and explain to them, here's how we're using this tool to provide better patient care, and that transparency I think is pretty good. Really what we learned is we actually have a regulatory framework that may address a lot of the issues. We may have to do some fixes on HIPAA for patient privacy. You've got a framework within the FDA that may get 75%, 80% of it right. Well, was not really thinking about the generative model when we put out the RFI, but that came back to us. Again, as you regulate and approve a product today, it's going to be a different product a year from now if it's learning. And then other areas that we've not been able to solve, interoperability of patient records. We still haven't solved that. These models are going to be a lot better the more data they have, the more that they can look at. What does that look like? How do you provide access to that data, but at the same time, provide, address the privacy issues and so forth. So I think that those are some of the things. Was not really thinking about the liability issues. Those are ones that we ought to think through, so it's not just determined through case law, but we actually proactively think about what that liability looks like as well.
And you mentioned also not wanting a patchwork of state laws, because that would, could be burdensome and could stifle innovation for sure. Something similar to what we've seen with the lack of a federal privacy bill.
Yeah, I mean the data privacy issue is one that we can't have 50 different data privacy laws. Obviously, California has a set of laws. I think we've got to think about this framework as a federal framework, and then to the extent possible as an international framework.
Great. Okay, now I'm going to open it to everyone. As leaders in the public sector, what do you see as the primary role of government in ensuring the responsible use of generative AI technology, particularly in addressing issues like disinformation and deception? I know that's like deep fakes. We have half of the world will be on elections. We'll be having elections this year. There are all of these fears about deception in regards to generative AI specifically. How are you all addressing it across your orgs?
I mean, we've got a campaign coming up, and it's going to be really interesting. You already had a fake Joe Biden robocall in Maine. So there's a real downside and a danger of this. How do we work with the industry to sort through what's authentic, what's fake? It's not going to be easy. I mean, but I think it is worth thinking about what that looks like. Again, and I'm thinking about it in the context of an election that's coming up right now.
I will just note, since we haven't, talked in depth about it, part of this is making sure our own workforces inside the government, at least in the Department of Defense, can be critical consumers and appropriately skeptical of the technology that's offered up and that's being adopted. And I think that, making sure that we have informed consumers inside the department and probably more broadly on what the technology is, but also where information can and might be false, where images or other information might not be produced with the sort of purest of intents, and just making sure that that level of skepticism is inherent in people who are looking at and adopting new technologies, both for the value proposition of the technology itself and to hedge against the risks. And so we're inside the Department of Defense, we're doing a lot of an increased amount of work on digital literacy, and that's everything from prompt engineering to how do you interpret things that you see that come out of even commercially available generative AI tools, so that our workforce is able to leverage the tools but do so in a responsible way.
I think Dr. Plum hits a very important issue, which is all of the work in the executive order across the administration to make sure that we are upskilling the federal workforce and increasing their knowledge of AI, both in terms of synthetic content authentication, but all of the different opportunities and risks that AI creates. At NIST and at the AI Safety Institute, our role, as I've said, is really to sort of advance the science of AI safety. And so we think about this issue in terms of our work on what are the best techniques presently available for detecting synthetic content and authenticating content? What guidance can we give the federal government as called for by the executive order to make sure that we are implementing those best practices? This is a space where the science is evolving so quickly that helping say this is what works, this is what doesn't, is really important as we think about managing these broader issues.
Maybe just from the industry perspective, so as a caveat, our models currently output text, so we're not doing output of video or audio or images, which form a lot of the deepfake concerns. We're doing a few things. Number one is doing some research to see how good are these models at persuading people of something, right? If the models are very persuasive, that means they're going to be able to be used or misused in some significant ways in the context of elections or just more broadly. And what we found is that sort of current frontier models are almost as good within sort of the error bar of statistical error bar as humans of convincing humans or persuading humans of things. So we've done some research here, and we found that the models are starting to get to basically about human level of persuading people of something. Second, we have policies that prohibit the use of the models for electoral purposes or to generate misinformation or disinformation. It's fine to have a policy, but you also need to test and see what happens if people try to violate your policies. So we do something called policy vulnerability testing, where we have people red team the systems to see, can we get the models to do things they're not supposed to per our policies? And then we use that information to strengthen our policies and close vulnerabilities, but also add more technical safety layers. So any information that you put into our model goes through a classifier that looks at what is the prompt, what are you asking the model to do, and is it safe and responsible to allow that the model to sort of complete the task here. And I think we'll get better at that over time. And then finally, I think information sharing among industry and then between industry and government is really going to be critical here, and also civil society, right? We've seen in past elections networks of independent researchers that have done just a fantastic job of identifying misinformation campaigns, identifying fake news outlets and things like that, and then sharing that information with platforms or industry or folks in government so that people can take action based on what they're seeing. I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, OpenAI released a report that was looking at some of the misuse of their platforms they were seeing in elections. And I think that's a perfect example of, publishing that information, getting it into the hands of developers and other researchers, getting it into the hands of folks in government that can take action based on this. That's what's going to be needed to, deal with a threat that's really a whole of society challenge.
I think that's a really good point that you led on transparency, and that's like the crux of everything that you all have been saying is about responsible AI and the need to deploy this responsibly, whether it is being transparent if there are any vulnerabilities to your models, or making sure that people have the education needed to make sure that they can understand if they're seeing any type of misuse happening. One thing that I know Amazon is doing, we have Titan image generator to assure that you can see if an image was done via AI or if it's in its natural state. For a way to close out, what advice would you all give the leaders in this room, knowing that there are different stages in their generative AI journeys? I mean, so much has happened in 2 years, but it's still ever evolving. As they think about their own responsible AI policies and adoption of generative AI, like what is something that you would each tell them to walk away with?
Maybe I'll start off. I think, think broadly about potential use cases. People think about chatbots as, oh, this is this thing where you kind of like have a fun conversation with it. But the way to think about it is actually more like the junior analyst on your team, right? The models can do, we talk about generative AI and people think about sort of image generation and so on. But these models can basically do the kinds of tasks that you would ask a junior analyst on your team. They have a cognitive and analytic capability. It's still sort of nascent, it's getting better all the time. But that means you can apply it to all kinds of different challenges within your organization. And just to go back to what Dr. Plum was saying, I think having clearly defined use cases and ways that you're going to test and evaluate to see whether the models actually work, because you have to see is a model from company A work better than company B's for a particular use case and so on. And the more clearly developed your evaluation metrics are, the more that you can make sure that your goals for responsible deployment and use are being met, that the accuracy and other requirements are being met, and that the technology is actually up for the task.
I'll just build on that to say, I think the single thing we can do to have meaningful adoption of these sort of new frontier models is to think about them in where we can take responsible risks. There are lots of places, sort of to the points already made, where these models can be extremely valuable in replacing really tedious tasks that take a lot of time and freeing up that time to do things that only your workforces or your people or your subject matter experts can do. And there are places where kind of saving time there is worth the risk, and places where the models are not reliable enough to do that. And if you start from your use cases and work backwards to where the technology fits in and think about where you're comfortable taking risks sort of bounded in a structured framework. We use responsible AI framework in DoD, but there are sort of ethical principles that have been shared more broadly. I think that can really help folks sort of take some of the mystery and magic out of it, but also some of the fear and nervousness about where there's potential.
I would +1 to both of those comments in terms of thinking broadly about the use cases and adoption, as well as I like your responsible risk framework. But I think all of that really requires staying incredibly up to date on what are the advances that are happening, reading the papers, listening to the podcasts. It's moving so quickly that just having that knowledge base to inform decisions, I think, is really important for both corporate and government leaders. I also think it's really important to look at this in an international perspective, and that's one of the things that's come up. I mean, it's part of why the work that we're doing at the AI Safety Institute is launching a network of AI Safety Institutes globally, where we're able to get the technical folks in the room and talk about what should testing and evaluation look like, what should risk mitigations be, both to make sure that we're learning from each other, given how quickly it's moving, but also that we're moving towards aligned and interoperable standards and evaluations so we can really enable the innovation to thrive. So we just really encourage folks to think about this in a global perspective and keep an eye on everything that's happening in so many other countries.
And just to kind of play off of that, think of the federal government, the public sector, as a partner here. And I'd use social media as an example. We really relate to the game in kind of looking at the benefits and the impact of social media. Now we're starting to do it, but it's much harder at this stage. So as this is evolving very quickly. Think of the public sector as your partner here. Because again, our mandate is to think about the public good, the global good here. And we should be partners in this because it is going to impact every aspect of our lives.
Thank you all for your time and your words, and thank you all for joining us today.